We believe that this is, and not only that, but as I already gave you an example, you're promoting homophobic ideals, such as in a Catholic school, they do tell you that homosexuals will go to hell. And this is intrinsic to religion because that's what the scripts say. So you're not empowering the education of minorities because you're saying that if women education, for instance, is less valuable than men education. But more importantly, why are we necessarily creating more exposure with this policy? Because of the fact that when I go to school, I have to necessarily interact with every single individual for different classes. And I have just every time with them, we believe that it is more likely that you will engage with them. We don't believe that there's a single person that does not engage with anyone in their school. So you won't necessarily have this, but most importantly, you will realize that they are just people like you. They go to the same school, they learn the same things, and ultimately, if they have a different perspective on something else, that's perfectly okay, but you do not authorize them, and this is perfectly fine. But most importantly, we believe that the reason why contact theory will work on our side is because of what we already told you. These children are young, and therefore they are able to overcome this bias. So ladies and gentlemen, please promote the side that promotes acceptance. Promote the side that values the real freedom of choice. Promote the side of the proposition. Thank you very much.
I'd now like to call Kartik to give his speech.
Let's be clear on what these religious schools are. They're not extremist madrasas where the only thing you learn is how to be an Islamic scholar, or the only thing you learn is what your religion teaches you. It's generally schools where you have religious education integrated into what you learn in a national curriculum. It's where you have prayers every morning and after lunch and at the end of school, and a mandated religious studies class, and you also learn math, you learn science, you learn everything that any other student would, you learn everything that you need to have for a good education. That's the kind of comparative they fail to draw, that's the kind of characterization they fail to address. That's not what religious schools actually look like on their side. They've been trying to rebut a side that doesn't exist. We think that ultimately, our burden in this debate is to show you, first, that parents have the right to choose an education for their children, and second, that their policy leads to worse educational outcomes for children. They are to defend a world where the children of extremely religious parents can be denied access to education at all due to the views of their parents. This will be clear, right? We have three arguments here today. First, on the right to choose on parents and how their policy infringes on it. And second, why their policy leads to worse outcomes for children. And my second speaker will be telling you about safe spaces for minority religions and why faith schools are particularly important in those cases. Before that, some points of rebuttal. First, on their model. The only thing they had to say on the model was just change them to secular schools, just abolish this religious class. There was no incentive on their side for these religious organizations to continue to fund this school, to continue to have this school in the first place. If they can't impart religion, which is generally the motivation for setting up the school to begin with, then why will they have it at all? No response from their side. If they can't show it, we must assume that these schools will somehow close down, and that people will no longer be able to access education from them. That's worse on their side. Next, there was no reason to believe that there will be actually real change, no checks and balances on these schools. The teachers in these schools are still generally quite religious. The people around them are still generally quite religious. All the influence they wanted to talk about still exists on their side when the only thing they want to do is abolish religious studies. They haven't solved anything. As a result, they've chosen a soft line. They haven't solved anything. They have no case. Next, on the second thing they said, on the duty of the state to provide secular education. This was a waste of time because it's basically an argument for the state to fund secular schools. We support that. We think it's a good idea. We think it's good to provide access to secular education. We don't think it's good to mandate that. They didn't provide any justification for that mandation. Third, and they said that you'll get no perspective except your schools, you'll be sort of brainwashed, right? This is false. You generally have outside influence other than school. You're influenced by other people, your friends, your neighbors, people you meet at classes and other things you participate in as a living. The idea that the only influence you ever have in your life is your school teachers and your parents is false. We reject that characterization. We don't think that kind of brainwashing happens just as a result of faith school. Even if it does happen, it generally happens to people who are in such communities, like they have ultra-conservative parents and they live in purely religious communities, and it would have happened anyway. Even if they didn't have religious schools, that's something they haven't solved in the first place. The rest of my rebuttal will be integrated into substantive. So first, on our principles, why parents have the right to choose the education for their children. This matters because their policy restricts parents' rights in an intolerable manner. How is this true? First, we recognize in the status quo that parents have overwhelming duties to raise their children. They raise them, they're accountable for them, they protect them from harm. And as a result of this duty, we recognize certain rights that they have to make decisions for their children, particularly when it's subjective. Second, given that they have the most information about their children, we recognize that they are in the best place to decide what is best for their children and not the state who doesn't know them at all. Given that this information exists and this subjectivity exists, we recognize that they have the right to decide what sort of thing their child wants. For example, in healthcare, we give them the right because we recognize there is no objective good in healthcare. We recognize that if certain parents want to give them this care, certain parents want to give them that care, we recognize that's a legitimate choice. And education is simply an extension of that principle. And finally, we recognize the right to teach religion to your children, even if it's not in the form of education. Like, for example, the fact that they conceded that parents can still send their children to mass on Sunday, even though there was no freedom of choice involved there, even though the children never really consented or had objective freedom to decide to go to that church. We recognize this right to impart religion, and as a result, it's only a logical extension. We recognize the right to choose a religious education as a result of this. But what did we hear from them on the principle? What we heard was parents' rights don't extend to causing harm to your children. First, they never established any harm as a result of this. And that's not a principle either, right? The fact is, if you say our principle is that it leads to better outcomes, that's based on outcomes. We'll show you how we have better outcomes on our side, not on their side. They never established any objective harm. It was essentially, we don't like what they're doing, therefore we'll stop it. The only actual principle justification they had was freedom of choice doesn't exist. So let's address that. First, wow, 5-year-olds are going to have such freedom of choice to decide what school they want to go to. 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds are going to have such freedom of choice to decide their school. No, in any case, your parents are always going to choose the kind of school you go to. That's what they conceded as well in that POI. So clearly, their principle can't stand either. Yes?
If religious education is not imparted throughout schools, can parents still teach religion in their homes?
Exactly, that's the problem with your side. Given that the people who are generally sent to faith schools are generally children of ultra-conservative parents, given that in faith schools you can at least monitor what the children are being taught and make sure they're not being taught really obscure and extremist things, you can't do that with parents. You can't be assured that parents aren't imparting incredibly radical or extremist teachings to their children. That's why it's better to have faith schools which can be regulated, right? That leads me nicely to my second argument as to how their policy leads to worse educational outcomes. Let's clarify that. First, we mean less access to schools, and second, we mean less schools existing in the first place.
Fine, sir.
Who is mostly affected by this? Atheist children don't go to faith school. Children of moderately religious parents generally don't go to faith school either. The people who are religious, or very religious, are the ones who tend to send their children to faith school in the first place. Let's consider the outcomes for these children. On our side, what happens is they have access to these schools. Particularly in the developing world, this is really important. Quite often, in areas where parents aren't fully aware of the importance of education because the government hasn't told them, but they still understand the real importance of religion, that's where they're able to send their children to faith schools to get a kind of education that they might not have gotten otherwise. Particularly with respect to girl children who are generally seen as less important and less deserving of education, they're the ones who get chances to go to faith school and not on their side. Moreover, it has more schools because the public system is just not enough. Like, for example, the fact that in the UK, religious schools have much better educational outcomes than the public school system because of the fact that they're much better, they have better teachers, that's why they have better scores overall. But on their side, some parents are much less likely to send their children to secular schools because of the fact that they are very religious themselves and they don't believe a secular education is better. What would they do instead? Generally, in the developed world, home tutoring. They try and give them home tutors to teach them the kind of thing they want, as well as having religious studies. And there's no way to regulate this. There's no way to assure that what they're being taught is actually something that is important to them. It's actually something that follows national curriculum standards, something that will help them in actual education. It's even worse in the developing world because often the alternative is no school at all. That means that they simply don't have any chance at all. They simply continue to have the sort of religious indoctrination that they had a problem with at home. They don't get any benefits as a result of their policy. They have access to fewer schools and they don't get those schools at all. Their policy worsens outcomes for children. It hurts the rights of parents to decide what they want for their children. Stand with opposition.
Thank you, Karthik, for your speech. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 12 seconds. So, Karthik, I'm sorry.
It's now my pleasure to ask Ernesto to do this.
Religion should be something to be understood. It shouldn't be used as a tool of systematic oppression. Religion, through its simplification, should not allow individuals to grow in circumstances when they're only exposed to one perspective, to one ideology, to one view of the world which can exclude others, which does isolate communities, which doesn't allow individuals to become good citizens. We don't think that this fulfills the role of the educational system. as second proposition speaker up as my own team's third argument. Before I go into any of that, let's go into address the mechanism or that proposed by team proposition. We told you how we would be abolishing schools, but at no point did we state that schools would be completely shut down. We think that this is a waste of infrastructure. More necessarily, we told you that even if teachers would still want to teach religious education, this wouldn't be allowed. There would be state supervision over this. So yes, we still maintain the infrastructure. You still allow teachers to remain in places, and you still allow people in management to keep their positions. The only difference is they can no longer use those positions to teach through religion. We are abolishing this. With that stated, let's go into team opposition's case. And they mentioned two main arguments. In the first one, they talk about parents' choice, no thank you, and they mentioned two main impacts. First of all, it's how parents should be allowed to make decisions for their children. And second of all, it's how even if that weren't true, then individuals and children will still be exposed to religious perspectives. So our mechanism on our policy on behalf of Team Mexico won't really be doing anything. But let's address both of these points. On the idea of parents' choice, no thank you, we still told you how individuals should still have some degree of choice as to what religion they choose to be. We do think it is part of their choice, but more importantly, by abolishing religious education, you guarantee a different perspective for individuals to live through. On the second idea given by proposition, is they say that individuals will still be continuously exposed by neighbors and by family members and by relatives who could still in any form perpetuate their own religious experience. No, thank you. And we think because it is that individuals are susceptible to be influenced by individuals near them, that they should be guaranteed a different perspective, at least within an educational context. Children spend anywhere from 8 to 10 hours a day on school. We do think that this is sufficient time in order to present a different perspective. More importantly, we do see that yes, even though parents can make decisions for their children, they should also not impose those decisions on their children. And should parents be using their parents' rights in order to abuse of their children, this is also problematic. The state also is justified in intervening for this. More importantly, we do think that in their second argument, thank you, they mentioned two main problems. First of all, how we'll be taking down schools, getting rid of infrastructure, and teachers won't want to teach. I've already addressed this, but much more importantly, they mentioned the idea of how private education, and particularly education through faith schools, is sometimes the only alternative. But this is also based on a false dichotomy on the side of opposition, where they give a choice on individuals going to public school or to private school or to faith school. This isn't necessarily true. We do think that under a status quo where religious education isn't allowed in public schools, the reason why faith education is better isn't because it's faith, it's because it's private, because it does get more funding from individuals. We do think that this would still happen and parents would still have an incentive, no thank you, to fund education because their children are still going to be learning different things. We don't think that, we do implore team opposition to prove why faith education is intrinsically better than any education the state could offer. And finally, even if parents are and other groups are no longer incentivized to fund education, we don't think that's a problem. And second, sir, we do think the state could still give education. Yes.
For the first time in your speeches, tell us why the church will still fund these schools on your side of the house.
I understand your point, sir. And yes, even if the church stopped funding it, we do see the state could provide funding. Even if that weren't true, parents still want their children to learn, so they could provide funding. We do see that even if none of that were true, other groups and other groups do have some vested interest into people learning. They could also provide funding. With that stated, let's go into team proposition's third argument, in which I'll talk to you about why religion is complex and why thus that justifies it no longer being taught principally within primary and secondary education. We see that religion is a very complex issue, and some aspects of it cannot just be taught, but much more importantly, within education, we also talk about how subjects influence each other. Particularly with a heavy content issue such as religion, it will definitely affect other issues. We see this happening in the past. We see this happening within the United States, where certain teachers are legally allowed to not teach evolution because it goes against certain religions. We think this is harmful. We think that this does impede in the proper development of other subjects. But much more importantly, even when you do have religion being taught at such a basic level within education, you also allow religion to be taught through various misconceptions and simplifications. You're talking about religions which were which by industry being presented could be seen as misogynistic, as trying to harm women's rights or the rights of other majorities, such as the LGBT community. And even though religions don't aim to ostracize these individuals, through their simplified presentation, their bias can be misunderstood by individuals. So how does our policy change this? First of all, we do allow each subject to develop individually without obstructions from religion, and more importantly, we still allow individuals to pursue religion through a much more specialized perspective. We do see that if individuals want to pursue religion as a more educational basis, they could still choose to do so through some sort of separate or higher education. But much more importantly, we do see that pursuing religion through this higher education, once again, does mean that individuals would no longer be susceptible to be using religion as a means to oppress minorities. You do get rid of this idea of otherization, and religion can no longer be used as a tool to ostracize people. With that, let's go on to the re-strengthening of our own first two arguments. I've already addressed most of the rebuttal. They mentioned how we said that individuals have no freedom of choice. We said once again that the choice should lie within the individuals, as the choice will be affecting them mostly. But much more importantly, we told you how the state does have the obligation to provide holistic education. And because religion is an issue which affects the individual, thank you, but not always the state, it shouldn't be something which the state should support. We think the state should once again monitor education through much more specialized basis. So thank you. One of the other points raised up by opposition is the idea that that the state can also monitor education so that they can't teach anything too radical. But we do think that this is precisely what happens under the status quo. Yes, under either side, what parents choose to teach their children will not be monitored, but once again, proposition does guarantee an environment where a different perspective will be given. Why is this true? Parents and teachers can no longer indoctrinate individuals through education within their own schools, so they are forced to see another perspective, but much more importantly, you no longer have this perspective of isolation or otherization. We see that if individuals continuously go to school for 8 hours a day, they will be forced to engage with individuals of different religions, of different ideologies, of different beliefs. We do think that this intrinsically does, through content theory, incentivize them to forces them to see new perspectives. We do see that the role of the educational system is not only to allow the individual development of subjects already proven, but it also must allow individuals to be proper citizens. We do think that citizens will only be proper once they learn to acknowledge each other's perspectives. Once again, we don't think religion should be used as a tool for ostracization. We think it should be understood. We think that education should fulfill its role. This is not happening through religious education.
Thank you, Dr. Carlos, for your speech. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 16 seconds.
Please welcome Hemant, the second
Team Mexico loses this debate is because not once in two speeches have they told us what the impact of a faith school on a community is. All their arguments for so far have been collections of assertions using buzzwords like indoctrination or isolation without ever explaining to us what a religious school does and how this affects them. Apart from the only example or the only layer of analysis they gave you, that apparently they teach homophobia and suppress your sexuality. By that definition, this debate is about schools below high school, that is to say about primary schools. We don't understand how the biggest layer of analysis, which was homophobia, is applicable to say children over 6 years. What the comparator they fail to understand is that faith schools often rather preach things like God is good or God will protect you, and we argue to you that parents are more likely to approach these kinds of schools and therefore access to education is better on our side of the house. The only other argument they had came in their second speech about how education should be good and independent, and with this I'll deal in my constructives. So what are the major two things that we've seen so far? The entire case has been a collection of outcomes based on which their principle was also set. They tell you that indoctrination happens in faith schools. Not only was their principle, that freedom of religion argument, dependent on these outcomes, the entire first speech, which is things like isolation or indoctrination, were all dependent on them showing us that this religious schools is forcing a particular thing on you, or that it improves on their surveillance. Not only let's first remember that they have left out the second part of the debate, which is to show how this indoctrination is lesser, or the quality of this indoctrination improves on their surveillance. But second, I'm going to take down their entire first speech by taking down the premise that this indoctrination is, by taking down the comparative of this indoctrination. So the kind of narrative they create on their side of the house is that their policy is seen as an attack on religion. That is to say that on our side of the house, when parents and religious groups think that the schools that they send their children to will teach religion on their behalf and trust these schools to do these religious teachings, on their side of the house, when they know that these schools are now abolished and are now seeing the state as attacking their ability to allow other people to teach them religion, it creates the type of not just resentment, but the feeling that they have to take it upon themselves to teach their children this religion. What this means is that religious groups and parents work together on their side of the house to indoctrinate their children, and this happens in a much larger extent because of two things. One, because it's more easier to do direct attacks. Like for example, as a Catholic faith school, you cannot say actively that Muslims are bad, but as a Catholic parent, you can. Why? Because there are no checks on you that we can levy as a state. But second, we think it's even more worse because when religious groups are now colluding with parents to do this, which is the comparator they will defend on their side, there are no checks and balances as they exist on our side. Educational access, whereas, like we told you in our first speech, provides you exposure to things in life, to issues in life, like for example through social studies classes. Therefore, we think that indoctrination is much less when you are at least exposed to a good quality of education, when you are exposed to other students and therefore have access to the ability to question. Therefore, we think on balance, our arguments about how access to education is more important and about how parental rights need to be respected in this case win against this clash. Therefore, I've already taken down the entire first speech. But what are the things we told you in our very first speech? We told you that access to education is important, and we told you this in two ways. Firstly, in availability. On their side of the house, they tell you that apparently when we asked them in a POI about this, individual parents will fund education for the entire community. This is ridiculous. The second thing they tell you is that public schools can be trusted. And then later in the same speech, they went on to tell you that the reason private schools, the reason religious schools have better outcomes is because private schools have better quality. Therefore, they concede that public schools are of lesser quality and are still happy to overburden them with the thousands of students that parents are only left to send, like that modern parents would send to public schools. But the most important analysis we gave you under this is that parents often now don't send their children to school at all, because a lot of times the parents who would send their children to religious schools are extremely religious and they fail to engage with this in any level. Therefore, in their best case, even when these schools are converted into non-faith schools, we think it's only cosmetic change, and it's even more dangerous when schools don't advertise themselves as faith schools, call themselves secular schools, but then still subtly preach religion because there are no checks you can levy in this case. Moving on to my constructives, but I'll take you.
Yes. When Shia and Sunni schools continuously demonstrate that their own branch of Islam is superior, how does this not fracture society?
Shia and Sunni schools, the way you've been portraying it, exists in states like Iran, for example. By your definition, this debate happens in secular states, and that is excluded from this debate. Therefore, it's irrelevant. What is my constructive? Education is better imparted in a safe environment. We reject the idea that only majority schools have religious schools. We think that what they fail to engage with is that minority religions obtain community support through religion. What is the comparative in this debate? On their scenarios, when they talk to you about secular schools, what they're talking to you about are schools that are dominated by majority religions, and therefore the school is a traumatizing experience for minority religions. That is to say that you are bullied systematically. As a Jewish child in a majority school, your nose is made fun of in every turning. That's why, for example, in the US, Jewish children are more likely to take rhinoplasties even when their nose has any form of change. But second, they are also often excluded from activities. That is to say that they are not taken in projects. No one wants an Abdullah on their side of the house in their sports team or in their club, for example. Based on their name, their color of the skin, and their hijab, students from minority religions are systematically excluded from a good quality of education on their side of the house. This is in direct clash with any of their arguments about diversity being good or you being able to understand others' religions or that minority religions are being suppressed by faith schools. No, it is secular schools that provide this traumatizing experience for pupils from minority religions. But what's the comparative that exists in the case of faith schools? There is a communal support. That is to say that by their definition, minority religions are ostracized to such an extent that they're seen as others. Therefore, we argue the only support system they have is the solace of their community. As a result of having pupils who relate with them and understand the discrimination they face on a daily basis, we argue that the fellow students on our side of the house are much more friendly, are much more cohesive, and as a result of this, there is much more communal inclusion and more happy surroundings in an educational system. Therefore, we think education is better imparted without this fear and trauma. That is to say that as a child, you don't have to fear a person attack, a joke based on your religious identity. You don't have to, as a Muslim person wearing a hijab, be frightened that the moment you enter a class, someone will impersonate a bomb blowing up. That is traumatizing and ridiculous. That is why that we argue to you that in an education that happens in a safe environment, you are more likely to succeed. That's why in the UK, 73% of faith schools were good or outstanding in the secondary level, whereas only 60% of national schools were good. That is why secondly, primary schools had 74% greater were ranked as outstanding by the National School Authority, but only 66% of public schools got this rating. As a result of this, we think it is in the big picture on our side of the house that students can develop and succeed in their life. Any form of integration happens on our side of the house when in the long term there are role models, there are successful individuals who have been exposed to education and have achieved a good quality of education. Their perception of what a good or perfect schooling is imposed by their privilege. We argue that access to education and more students attending schools is fundamentally important. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Herman, for your speech. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 23 seconds.
I'd now like to call Alejandro
of education, and ultimately why does this motion talk about primary and secondary schools? What we see is that on their team opposition, they have a clear misconception about what should we actually do in the motion. First of all, the previous speaker just conceded the entire principle debate to us. And why is this so? They told us that there are harms in the status quo, that if we integrate a Jewish person into a Muslim or Catholic society, what we ultimately will see is that people will bother that Jewish person because he has a big nose. We'll ultimately see that, first of all, they're conceding the fact that there is no integration whatsoever onto their system. Second of all, what we see is that in no way whatsoever are they actually diversifying or actually going with the purpose of education, which is not only to create citizens that can interact in the world, but most importantly to form people that are able to see past judgments. We on Team Proposition have two main standpoints. The first one being, there is nothing wrong with individuals learning religion. The thing is that if we want to separate religion from education, we see that religion is something individual, while the process of education is a collective that, most importantly, influences for a societal process. Therefore, what we see is that under team opposition, they themselves are conceding that that collective is directly being harmed, no thank you, by us not allowing for individuals to integrate due to the same structural barriers that exist simply because we allow for religious teaching to happen in primary and secondary education. Throughout my third speech, I'll be answering three main points of clash in order to prove why we have the comparative under team proposition. The first point of clash being on rights, the second one being on optics and perspectives, and the third one being on the educational outcome. But before I do any of that, let's address the main flaw that we have on their side. And the main flaw that they're ultimately trying to promote is a false dichotomy in which proposition ultimately wants to ban religion. We told you that under no way whatsoever will we ban religion because we have and we believe that there are individual freedoms. But once we talk about individual freedoms, we also acknowledge the fact that if there is a direct harm that might be contributed by protecting freedom and rights, especially in educational institutions, therefore we have the justification to intervene. Now, no thank you. Let's follow into the first point of clash, that one of rights. And here we have that they completely dropped our analysis of why the individual has more of a right than the parents' rights themselves and the harms that we promote once we decide to promote the parents' rights. Now, let's talk about something very fast. We ultimately believe that individuals are not born racist. Individuals are not born with xenophobic behavior. Individuals do not hate individuals because of them being from a part of a certain religion. What we ultimately see is that that type of biases that is constructed throughout social experiences. And if we if we make individuals only experience a certain type of perspective, which they themselves already conceded, because individuals interact with their own communities, with their friends, with their families, and therefore they gain their knowledge on religious teaching, and because institutions such as school that are fundamental because we see that we're going to develop the character of individuals since an early age until they're already formed throughout the entire educational process, what we see is that in no way whatsoever are they changing the system. Now, in terms of rights, we have two main lines of rebuttal. First of all, what we ultimately see is that if the parent's right is damaging the individual, that means their children, we ultimately have a moral obligation to engage with this type of rights. What we see is that sometimes parents' rights ultimately damage these individuals by excluding them from a larger spectrum of society. Second of all, we're not necessarily damaging or extremely violating completely the parents' rights. We believe that parents do have the right to teach religious education in their homes. However, we believe that it is the state's obligation to not provide any preference whatsoever to any particular, to not allow that any preference whatsoever is seen under a particular educational system. Now, here we have a clear delineation. Now, what they want us to believe is that private schools are essentially better because they teach religion. In no way whatsoever have they proved that. The point that they're making is about funding. We have three responses. First of all, funding can come from independent groups that are not necessarily religious but ultimately want to fund education. Second of all, states could also contribute to the legislative part of the funding of these actual institutions. And third of all, what we ultimately believe is that funding by churches in terms of these institutions is not the holistic approach of the scenario. What they tell us basically is that we should not worry about whether or not a Shia or a Sunni school present clashing perspectives on that on Islam, because that only happens under non-secular states. They're not engaging with our analysis. What we told you is simple. Regardless of whether or in which state this is being taught, we have a clear harm. That one that it's not necessarily the religion, but it's the perspective in which religion is being taught. We see that in some Sunni schools, they're going to teach them that they are right. In some Shia schools, they're going to teach them that they are right. And what we ultimately have is we have them fueling a cycle of otherization, fueling a cycle of violence, and they themselves are doing nothing to break through that cycle. Not only that, but once we talk about the individuals' rights, we believe that they're forcing the indoctrination of individuals in a system that does not allow them to accept or reject certain religions. Because if under their side, the only way that you can get education is through a religious education, then first of all, you're imposing your own ideals on individuals simply because of their needs. Now, moving on into the second point, yes sir, why not?
We've already told you that indoctrination is worse on your side. Given this, engage with our argument about access to education that we made in first speech.
Thank you, sir. First of all, you never told us why indoctrination is worse on our side. You simply supported that with blanket statements, such as in your side, the harm still exists. What we ultimately see is that indoctrination is actually worse on your side, because if your comparative is true that individuals only can pursue religious education because it's the only system that they actually have, then you're forcing those individuals to religious indoctrination. Now let's move on to the second point of class, that one of optics and perspectives. And what we told you is that we need some sort of interaction, some sort of contact between these individuals. First point of clash. They tell us that we, in our system, cannot provide a check against religious parents that are extremists. What we see is that the best check that we can have is education. And why is this so? First of all, education forms an individual. Second of all, if the parents are extremists, which we do not see that to be the majority of the cases, then what we ultimately see is that by interacting with people with different religions, by interacting with a system that itself that does not delineate an institutional preference for a religion, we create a perfect check against these parents. Why? Because we're actually providing a perspective to break towards that cycle. On your side, the check does not even exist because you're not allowing for these individuals to form part of a system that is more collective, a system that is more holistic. Second of all, what we see is that you yourself have told us that under the first generation of these people, no thank you, the first generation of students that are integrated into our system will still suffer some sort of discrimination. To that, we have to concede to a certain point that hatred will exist under this first generation. However, as time progresses and as individuals interact throughout an educational system and realize that we're all students, that even regardless of our religious preferences, we are equally as competitive, equally as good, equally as smart. That is where we create real social change. Because on your side, you're having these people that are excluded continue to be excluded, continue to be marginalized. You're not changing the system. No, thank you. Now, what we ultimately see, that's a clear benefit that you didn't even contest on your side, is the fact that we are not, throughout our side, throughout having this positive integration, we're validating some religions. For example, the perspective, the false notion that Islam is a religion that teaches terrorism, radical extremism, would be super diminished under our side once we allow that individuals interact amongst each other. Therefore, what we're ultimately doing is proving that religion is something personal that should be respected under all individuals. Finally, let's move on into the last point of class, that one of educational outcome. What we see is that, first of all, our outcome is more holistic. Second of all, what we have is that we allow for both the religious teaching of individuals to happen at home, but also to have a holistic educational environment. Second of all, what we see is that in terms of the complexity, no thank you, out of order, in terms of the complexity behind the religious subjects, they have to concede to a certain extent that these will be undermined. That the system itself will provide a very basic system of religion. What we see is that through that basic system of the religion, they're not only damaging religion itself, but damaging the individuals. And that's why we proudly propose.
Thank you, Alejandro, for your speech. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 14 seconds. Sorry. 8 and 14.
my pleasure to ask Dan and Jay to give a speech.
Panels, in this debate, proposition has never debated the comparative. They've never debated our comparative of what happens when you leave this education of this religion to ultra-conservative parents. They've never debated the comparative of how when you shove hundreds and hundreds of children into grossly underfunded public schools where the roofs collapse on the children while they're studying, it's not really a good outcome. They've not debated the comparative. At the end of this debate so far, after their three speeches, only one point vaguely stands. Their point on different perspectives and interaction. And I'll be dealing with exactly this throughout my speech. Because firstly, just to highlight an initial claim, they have not shown you why this interaction is likely to be good, or with our analysis on how they're unlikely to go to schools in the first place, why this interaction will even happen on their side of the house. I'll get to it in further detail throughout my speech. But what's the first question you need to ask? A question on rights, on legitimacy. Do parents have the right to freedom? What did we tell you? We told you that parents are the best placed individuals to make this choice, and they do have an inherent right on influencing whether or not they decide to teach children religion. Now, there was this false claim on their side of the house that since parents are infringing on the children's right to choose intrinsically, they are liberating the children. But that's false. Let's establish something right now. They are lying when they tell you that they give children any real choice on their side of the house. The only real difference is that the choice of education of the children is now going from the parents to the state. That is the difference. And we told you why the parents are much better placed than the state to make this objective decision on every single child inside their borders. We told you why parents are best placed. They have not rebutted any of this analysis, and so they lose on the legitimacy of the decider. They also had another vague principle under this point on how it's the duty of the state to provide better education. Firstly, that's not a principle. That's an outcome. We can show you that there's better education under private school, under faith schools for certain cases, and we win this debate. Our second speaker told you multiple statistics and multiple reasons why faith schools do provide better results. No response. By their own criteria, they're losing on both counts of their principle, and even their outcome-based principle on their side. They cannot objectively tell you that secularism is always better in every single form of schooling, which they've been telling you. Religion, we contest the fact that religion has to be purely individual in nature. It is a community following that we believe you have the right to. You have the right to religious education simply because of the reasons which they told you in their second speaker that religion is complex and it's difficult to understand. Yes, that's why parents have a right to let the schools and let a regulated board teach children this complex construct which parents truly think that they want their children to learn. We've shown you through the principle that parents have the right to do this and that states are badly placed to do this. They fall on the principle. We're already winning this debate. But what's the more important debate on outcomes? Firstly, let's look at their extremely vague model that changed throughout their entire speeches. The question mainly was, who will fund these places? They conceded in their third speaker that the church is unlikely, or religious organizations are unlikely to fund these schools. What alternatives have they given you? Firstly, they give you individual organizations that care about education. No, they don't count. If they really cared about education, they would be doing this funding anyway. No reason why that funding increases on their side. Then they told you the parents, the middle class parents who are going to send, they are expected to not just give up the fees for the school, but to fund the entire school in the first place. No, that's abhorrent. And then they told you the state. And here is where we look at what truly exists as an alternative on their side of the house. Public schooling. And we told you how that is frankly pretty horrible in many places like developing nations. We're not all Germany, where you have pet turtles in every single public school you go to. There are countries like Bangladesh, Indonesia, Philippines and India, where public schools are frankly not a good alternative at all. At that point, we'd rather have faith schools with a little bit of religious indoctrination combined to public schools, which give you extremely bad quality of education and largely harm your chances in the future. That's a comparative they failed to realize. What did we tell you under this point? We told you radicalization is worse on their side of the house. They don't really give a different perspective when parents who are overly zealous and over religious don't send their children to school. We told you that even if they do send their children to some form of secular school, parents still have much greater an influence over the perspective of these children than the school. They're more likely to believe ultra-conservative parents than a secular school on our side of the house anyway. And as a result, we've shown you that radicalism gets worse on their side of the house. They've dropped our analysis on how this is seen as an attack on religion, and radicalism increases even more on that side. And as a result, we proved that radicalism is more likely. But what have they told you? They've told you firstly that these schools create isolations, and there's no counterbalance for things like homophobia, and that other religions are automatically portrayed as wrong. Firstly, we disagree with their characterization that this is really status quo. We tell you that most of the time there are these moderate schools, all they really do is teach religion, don't attack other religions. That's the status quo which usually happens. And for the status quo, where there are extremist schools, the parents who are sending these children to these schools know this curriculum. They know what's happening, and they're likely to be ultra-conservative. And once more, they fail to respond to any of our bench's analysis on what happens when these ultra-conservative parents don't send their children to school. They fail to respond to that, and so this creation of isolation is not really true, but it's even worse on their side of the house when all they have is a homeschooling parent who is unlikely to show them that. We showed you how in many developing nations, the incentive to educate their children is not as strong as the incentive to show your children through religion. When those two conflict, which is what they're making on their side of the house, we believe that many parents are likely to choose religion, and as a result, they create harmful outcomes. What is the second most important point throughout their bench? They told you secular schools force integration. They've given you that as their policy. I have 5 responses to this. Firstly, there's no responses to any of their bench on how this largely hurts minorities. All they told you was, we concede that the first generation is going to be absolutely victimized and harmed by their policy. I'll go on in another clash and tell you how that's abhorrent and extremely important in this debate, but that's an initial response. Secondly, secular schools don't really solve religious integration. They just avoid the subject of religion as a whole. Right? We have integration too when we've told you that people have outside influences. They have competitions which they go to throughout their religious schools. They have other people who they act with. And as a result, we tell you that the idea of secular schools forcing integration isn't really true. When furthermore, we told you that their secular schools aren't really truly secular. We gave you reasons why if they're having the same schools with the same teachers, they're unlikely to truly be secular. How do you disagree?
If conservative parents are still sending their children to religious schools, wouldn't their own views be perpetuated? Wouldn't they have other balance?
So the truth is that when conservative parents send their children to religious schools, they don't really see the need to educate their children on religion any further than they currently are, because they have faith in the fact that their school is doing enough of a job of teaching religion. That's why this extremism of certain extreme parents is less impactful on our side of the house than it is on yours. That comparative is extremely harmful for your case. Now lastly, they told you an abstract point on how religion can be taught badly and how faith schools will not properly teach religion and teach it that actually it's misogynistic. We tell you that's unlikely because faith schools actually have an incentive to make sure that they make their religion as representative as possible. And that's basically the end of that point. They fail to talk to any of our analysis on how this largely affects developing countries, where religion is one of the greater incentives than education as a prospect, and as a result, they lose this debate. But lastly, what is the most important point in this debate? It's basically the long term. It's in a large way our second speaker's argument on minorities, how they're largely affected, how they lose role models on their side of the house, how they lose integration on their side of the house. Their only response was, only the first generation is going to get utterly destroyed and shamed in public schools. We tell you that's not acceptable. And even to the extent to which we consider that acceptable, it's not just the first generation. People have been wearing hijabs in public schools for 150 years. We still don't see less discrimination. They have not truly defended secular schools as an alternative. They haven't shown you why children are going to go to secular schools. They haven't told you why secular schools are likely to be as effective. And as a result, we win this debate.
Thank you, Dan and Dave, for your speech. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 21 seconds.
It's now my pleasure to ask Kartik to give the opposition's reply speech.
We needed to focus in this debate on the most vulnerable people. The Muslim boy who faces discrimination in a Western society public school, not because of a faith school, but because society marginalizes him and white children don't want to have group projects with him or have him on the football team. The girl in India who can only learn math alongside the scriptures, and only that because the priest assured her parents that she would get a proper religious education. Their policy hurts these children. They recognize this, and that's why they backslid across 3 speeches on the outcome. Finally conceding that yes, they do hurt these people, but that's okay because somehow it's alright to use them as battering rams or social engineering for some long-term outcome that we never got to hear why it was likely to happen in the first place. They backslid on the principle, finally making their entire last speech about the outcome, and that's why we win this debate. First question, which side has better outcomes? We set up in first speech that our burden in this debate was to prove to you that their policy leads to worse educational outcomes. We've done that. How? First, we pointed out to you their model and how it essentially meant that they're going to have more public schools in the first place. We immediately pointed out to you all the problems of public schools. What happens when you send these children from relatively better funded faith schools with a little bit of indoctrination to public schools where they have the roofs falling in as they learn, but somehow that's okay because they're not being indoctrinated. Then we also told you that even if that's a problem, that doesn't change the attitudes of teachers, the attitudes of the other children who go to these schools. The passive indoctrination they wanted to talk about still happens on their side because of the fact that nobody changes. The only thing they had to say to this was that they're not allowed to teach. That doesn't change the fact they can still say it in interaction. When your teacher talks to you, when your classmates talk to you, that kind of indoctrination can still happen on their side. They don't solve it at all. And the most important thing here to think about was minority religions and the safe spaces they need. My second speaker made this argument in detail and told you about why they need this kind of safe spaces, why they don't have any sort of integration into society, why they need the safe space to grow up, to be successful in society, to have role models, and that they can be role models for future integration, to teach society in the future that maybe these religions can coexist and maybe these religions can coexist with society. There was no response except, yeah, it's just the first generation. It's not the first generation, it's every generation. We haven't seen a trend of societal integration since like Brown versus Board of Education. There's still been a trend to have black schools with majority people from one race and majority from another. Integration doesn't just work because you have a long time period. They didn't prove it at all. The harm that exists today will exist in the future as a result of their policy. The only thing they had to say was interaction and other perspectives. This was the cornerstone of their entire case and the reason why they thought they could win this. We took this down immediately when he told you that first of all, interaction and other perspectives already exist, like with your neighbors, like with your friends outside school, like with the other classes you go to. There was no response from them on this. The only thing they asserted was that school is a bigger influence. The only thing that they ever just stated this was, okay, what happens about after school? Like you can grow up and you're no longer always in school. There was no reason on their side to believe that if you're like 20 years old or 30 years old, then the fact that you learned something in public school, in faith school is going to stay with you for the rest of your life and you're always going to hate gay people. There was no reason on their side to believe that. They led to worse outcomes for the people who matter the most. That's why they've lost the debate. But secondly, on the rights and whose rights should be respected here. We told you about parental rights and how they have the right to make decisions for their children. They tried to hide their principle as individual rights when really they were trying to make the state force people to go to these schools. It wasn't an individual's choice, it was the state's choice that they were defending in this debate. They had to do this, they didn't do that. That's why they had no principle at all. When we pointed this out, they dropped it and simply said nothing about it afterward. That's why we met our burden on both of these counts, why we showed you it's principally unjustified and why it leads to worse outcomes for children and for minority religions who need these safe spaces and lead to worse outcomes. We win.
Thank you, Kartik, for your reply speech. speaking time was 4 minutes and 11 seconds.
It's now my pleasure to ask Isolde to finish this debate and give the propositions for speech.
Everyone ready? Yes. On their side, they tell us that neighbors, friends, and family give you a single perspective. On their side, that very same perspective is also in their education. On our side, we told you throughout our bench how that we forcibly give them another perspective. If they do not believe that having more holistic individuals is beneficial for society because you're able to grow with your community, then we really don't know in what world they are living. 2 points in this debate to explain why I say that we fulfill their criteria, and they're going to be the role of the state and outcomes, which after all were the 2 points that we agreed on. So let's go first to the role of the state. And the main thing that they tell us is that the state is trying to impose on rights, and they tell us that we drop this point. But since our very first speech, we tell you that the state, first of all, already imposes education, and B, if they are imposing the secular education, it is because it is in the best interest of the individual's rights. Let's go to why the right of the parents was efficiently contested and why is it that it is not the case. First of all, we are not fully compromising parental rights because they can still educate at home. That's first response. But second, we believe that the right to teach is not as important as my right to choose what religion I want to belong to. And why is my right more important? First of all, because I will live with that decision for the rest of my life. But second, because when they consider that freedom of speech that freedom of choice is important, your choice is not free if you were never exposed to other perspectives. They never tell us on their side why is that they are necessarily exposed to other perspectives, whereas we tell you this throughout our bench. Not only that, but as I told you in my introduction, they later on concede that they are already exposed to all of these other things because you're more likely to have your neighbors, your friends, your family have that. So they are conceding that it is good to have a check. When they tell us that there's no check on our side, we tell you, yes, there is, because you're going to have to interact with all of these people. Therefore, we do believe that it is the role of the state to limit the right that parents have without taking it away completely for the sake of your freedom of choice. You will be able to choose if you want to embrace the belief that your parents gave them. We will not force them on you. But most importantly, let's go to the point of outcomes. And first of all, let's talk about integration. And here's where they tell us that the main problem is that we never engage with the outcomes. But this is something that we did since the very first speech, and we find it rather offensive to say that we didn't. So first of all, let's go into integration. And here's where they believe that there has been no progress, and then in the reply speech they bring Brown versus Board of Education. We believe that you never told us why is it that isolation is a good thing. But we did tell you that integration is a good thing, and that it will happen simply because of the fact that these children are little. And why is this important? Because you will remove that bias because they are exposed since they are little. But even if the first generation is hard to change, we believe that in the long term this will change because this does happen. They tell us it doesn't, but we told you clearly that it does. And then their only response to this is ultra-conservative parents, and they tell us that they're not going to go to school. Oh, we tell you, how is that any different to one that's happening? Because if they are exposed at home, then that means that like this, the education that they receive is there. But we also told you that there's an incentive for them to send them to school because we believe that parents would make the choice to prioritize their children getting educated. So we do believe it would happen. But most importantly, the mechanism thing. They tell us that there's no funding and that it's going to be a problem and that we dropped that analysis, but we didn't, ladies and gentlemen. We told you throughout the bench that there are different ways through which you can fund education, and this is a good thing because you have third parties, you have the very parents, and you have public education. We believe that we aren't beneficial. But most importantly, they never engaged with the most important analysis that we gave you is that if you have this otherization that we presented since our first argument, you lead to things such as xenophobia that was presented throughout the bench. And this leads to intolerance behavior in society, meaning as in hate crimes, as in discussions in the street, any of these outcomes. And we believe that we did prove to you that this is more likely to happen when you have no integration whatsoever. If they are conceding the integration cycle thing, they never tell us why is that on their side it exists, even remotely. So even if we were to say that on our side it might be a little bit problematic at the first generation, on the long run, we do guarantee second perspective. So ladies and gentlemen, we also told you the House said that minorities' rights, women's rights are violated, and it tells us that this is not true. But even in the less radical schools, these are things that are intrinsically there in those religions. They consider that. So ladies and gentlemen, if you believe that the state has a duty to protect your rights, and not only that, but that you want an education that will benefit most individuals, we believe that you can only vote for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora Maria, for your speech. Speaking time was 4 minutes and 20 seconds.
Thank you very much for this debate. Please shake hands and wait